Today we will consider the programme motion on the amendment paper. We will then consider a motion to enable the reporting of written evidence for publication and a motion to allow us to deliberate in private about our questions for the oral evidence session. In view of the time available, I hope we can take these matters formally without debate. I first call the Minister to move the programme motion standing in his name, which was discussed yesterday by the programming subcommittee of the bill.
Move formally.
The question is that the programme motion as on the amendment papers, many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call the Minister to move the motion about written evidence.
Formally.
The question is the motion on the order amendment papers, many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. I call the Minister to move the motion about deliberating in private. The question is, Minister. The question is the motion on the amendment papers. Many of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Copies of written evidence which the committee receives will be made available in the committee room and will be circulated to members by email. We'll now go into private session to discuss lines of questioning. Good morning. We're now sitting in public and the proceedings are being broadcast. Before we start hearing from the witnesses, do any members wish to make any declaration of interest in connection with this bill? Yes.
I have a member of my son is in the Navy, so it's important just to say.
I think we can forgive you for that. Thank you very much. Is that all right then, everybody? Everybody happy? We will now hear oral evidence from Mariette Hughes, the Service Complaint Ombudsman. Before calling the first member to ask a question, I should like to remind all members that questions should be limited to matters within the scope of the bill and that we must stick to the timings of the programme motion. The committee has agreed. For this panel, we have until 9:55. Perhaps a witness could introduce herself for the record and say a few words.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm Mariette Hughes. I'm the Service Complaints Ombudsman for the Armed Forces. Very pleased to be here and talk about the bill because I think it is a positive and very important piece of legislation. Happy to answer any and all questions.
Mark Francois.
Good morning. Thank you for your time today. You described the bill as...
Can I stop you for a moment? I know a lot of you are new to the committee, so if you want to speak, just put up your hand in good time and the clerk will let me know and we'll get everybody in. I'm sorry to...
No, not at all, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. So you described the bill as positive. In your opinion, what are the main differences between your position and the Commissioner as proposed in the legislation, and how do you see those as advantageous?
So my current remit is extremely narrow. It does what it needs to do in providing that oversight of the service complaint system, but it does restrict me and those who work in my office to only looking at issues related to service complaints, so those complaints that have been through the system and applications that have directly been made to my office. Now, we know that there is an issue where not enough people complain. The number of people who report that they experience poor behaviours or unacceptable things in the workplace, and the number of people who then complain and then come through to my office, there is a huge delta between those numbers, and actually we're not able to look into the reasons why. So the ability to look behind those issues that are raised as pure service complaints is incredibly advantageous. For me, there's also an element of being able to look at the further level of so what. Too many times we look at a service complaint and we're considering whether or not that individual has been wronged because of whether or not a policy has been applied correctly to them, and that is as far as our analysis can go. What this would provide is the ability to go behind that and say, does this policy provide the best for our service personnel in terms of their welfare? So those are the key issues for me.
When you were doing your role, would you have preferred if you'd had the opportunity to do the sort of thematic reports that are envisaged in the bill?
Yes, absolutely. So when I last spoke in front of the House of Commons Defence Committee, we were mentioning that we would like those powers, and actually it's something that my predecessor had asked for as well. It's something that we were told previously until we got our backlog and our performance sorted wouldn't be able to be extended to us, but it's absolutely the direction we have been pushing. It is what we have been asking for years now, and we would be very excited by it.
Thank you. And lastly, if I may, sir, what's your current backlog of complaints? So because we're working on the assumption that when the roles transition, anything that, as it were, metaphorically was in your in tray will transfer over across to the Commissioner. So as of today, how many legacy cases, if we could call them that, would you envisage transferring across to the new organisation?
I say this with a pinch of salt because I haven't logged on this morning to check if we've had any new applications, but the backlog is 0.
Right, so
we have around 30 cases in active investigation. Any new cases coming into my office are instantly allocated out. We have brought the backlog down to nothing, and we are at 100% timeliness.
Well, if I may, having served on the committee and interviewed your predecessors, the Defence Committee, but not you, if I may, can I commend you on that? Because clearly a lot of work has been done in order to catch up. It was hundreds before.
Yes.
So if you're down to just 30 live cases, for the record, congratulations.
Thank you. It's been very important to us. When I took on the role, the wait time for individuals to have their cases looked at by my staff was around 9 months. Mm-hmm. And when you are the organisation that is holding the services to account for how swiftly they deal with complaints,
yes,
that doesn't fly very well. We have to be able to demonstrate that if we're going to be the champion of what good looks like, then we can apply those lessons to ourselves in order to make the services trust us. So I'm really pleased we've been able to do that over the last 3 years.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks much, and good morning. Thanks for joining us. Can I just pick up part of the point there about transfer? How do you envisage the transfer of staff operating from the existing system and further over? And then I've just got another couple of little points.
That is one of my main concerns, is ensuring that there is a smooth transition over. My staff are quite excited for the new remit. Again, it's something that we as an organisation have been pushing for a while, but naturally there is consternation, there is a little bit of anxiety around what this means for them. Broadly under the scope of the legislation, if the powers and functions of the Ombudsman are simply lifting and shifting under the Commissioner role, I would anticipate for the majority of my staff they would just continue operating as usual. It's absolutely key for us that we don't disrupt that really good work that's been happening. A lot of my staff have been at the organisation longer than I have, and they remember when the backlog was even worse than that. They are the ones who have done this work and delivered this performance. It would be absolutely devastating to them to see it disrupted. So ensuring that they have somewhere to operate from, have clear legislation, understand what they are able to do, and can just continue as usual is going to be really key. The other element that has to be considered is for the other side of our business, so those who look after our finance, our IT, our stats. Their roles would potentially need to expand to cover more under the Armed Forces Commissioner's Office. That's what needs to be established through a transitionary period.
Actually helpful, and the bill does provide for the Secretary of State to provide additional staff. Is that something that you would envisage being required very quickly, or is that something you think the current staff can cope with?
I think it would depend on the speed with which this goes through and the plans. I've noticed in the amendments there is something around setting out a proposed time frame. So depending on when you want the office to go live, I think there needs to be a significant scoping period on how many staff will be required and what that budget will look like. And there will be certain roles that you'll need ahead of others. There'll be certain roles within the current staffing at SCOAF that can simply pick up some of that work. We have staff within our organisation that were working for us at the point of transitioning from the Commissioner into the Service Complaints Ombudsman. So I have staff who have done this process who will be able to guide that through.
And just a last question from me. How do you envisage the new role working with the devolved administrations? And what was the Scottish MP? I'm thinking particularly of Scotland. How would that interact with the Veterans Commissioners that are in place at the moment? And do you see any benefits from this role as to what the existing role is?
Absolutely. I mean, it's all about collaborative working. There will be certainly areas where the Commissioner cannot sort of reach in and touch or have control over the provisions for service personnel in those areas, but it's about maintaining those good relationships. It's about ensuring that we're all trying to do the best for people, but we have those sensible conversations and everyone understands each other's remit, but that we're able to bring issues to the front and talk about them as we go. We're already doing some really good work with the EHRC on uniform protective services and behaviours. That's the sort of work I see expanding with this and with those devolved administrations, that we just sit round the table and talk about, well, whose job is it to take this forward, because we can all agree that this is what needs to happen for people.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
David Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mariette, for being with us today. Would it be possible just to sort of go into the timeline of how we've got to this point? So you talked about limited powers, and I completely agree with you. But from your perspective, from raising those concerns with the MOD, with ministers, how have we now got to this point where we're sat here talking about the Armed Forces Commissioner Bill?
I'm not entirely sure I can answer that one for you. I think we've sort of approached it from two different paths that have converged at a very convenient time. So I'm aware that the new government has been pushing this very hard, and it is something they feel very, very strongly about, and I am certainly in favour of it. Separately to that, within the Ombudsman community, there is a lot of talk about own motion powers, thematic investigations. I think there are only one or two other schemes within the UK that currently have these powers. So this is, sort of game-changing for everyone. So we have been talking about this certainly since I came into role and when we set up our new 5-year strategic objectives. One of those was around changing our own performance. One of those was around changing the relationship with the services. And the third one was around looking at the strategic and political landscape and how do we need to be fixed? What powers do we need to have in order to be able to affect real change for service personnel? So this has been something that's been part of our ongoing conversations for around 5 years.
Fantastic, thank you.
Madam Martin.
Thank you, and thank you for your service and what seems to be a great job in the circumstances. You alluded to the fact that it's been a long time coming, that it's something you've been pushing for, and that previously it had been no backlog. The aim of the new bill is to improve service licence conditions for service personnel. Having spoken to a number of them because of in my constituency in Portsmouth, one of the concerns, I think you echoed the fact that there seems to be a delta between the people that come forward and actually the things that happen.
Yes.
How do you see a change in a commissioner role improving those that come forward? Some service personnel are saying to me they still have concerns around the trust and will it affect their career if they make a complaint and those kinds of elements.
So trust and confidence in the service complaint system is something we've been driving hard as SCOAF, and that work would continue. What I think is interesting about the Commissioner role is currently when we do outreach visits, I sit down and do focus groups with service personnel where I kick all the chain of command out the room and get them to tell me what they actually feel, what they actually experience. And what's really interesting for me is in those conversations, a number of issues, frustrations, grumbles, gripes are raised, and they're not the sort of things that normally become service complaints, either because to the individual they don't feel big enough, or they don't feel like they've been personally wronged, it's just part and parcel of their service life, or they don't think that raising a service complaint will change it. We have those conversations because it relates to service complaints. It talks about that mental resilience, the things they are putting up with that chips away and then leads them to situations where they feel they have to complain. But under the Commissioner's powers, you'd be able to actually raise those issues and put those into reports that can be laid in the House, can be brought into the light. So all the issues people are telling us about, their accommodation or concerns around food or policies that are affecting their families. At the moment, I'm gathering that information as good background for service complaints. But the Commissioner role would be able to take that forward and say, actually, this is something that is affecting all three services, or actually it's only affecting this service more than the other. So it's going to be really rich information that's really going to help promote those welfare things that currently don't have enough of a light shined on them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Can I ask what your views are on the German Armed Forces Commissioner? Obviously, this has been modelled on that bill.
You can, of course. So I know Dr. Eva Hergel quite well. We are both members of the International Conference of Ombudspersons for Armed Forces, which is a mouthful, so ICOAF. So we have a conference every year. She is an absolutely incredible person, and she has done really, really good things with that office. I think it's an interesting model for this to be based on. I think there are naturally some differences that we have to be alive to. The key one for me, and apologies if this does come up later, is around the terminology. So Dr. Hergel is the Commissioner for the Armed Forces. Germany does not have a fully established Ombudsman scheme in the same way that the UK does. We have 22 established schemes under the Ombudsman Association. But in fact, on Eva's website, she describes herself as the Ombudsman for the Armed Forces. It's simply that the title, Parliamentary Commissioner, fits with their legal framework. There are some also interesting differences in that, Eva has had these powers for a long time and uses them very well. However, she doesn't have the oversight of service complaints that I have. So actually, this would be an extended remit as compared with the German model. I think it's absolutely brilliant to draw that inspiration from it. And as I say, being members of those communities together, we are always looking at best practice in other countries. I think there are necessarily some differences in this country, but it's certainly a good starting point.
do you think it will translate, the German model will translate into the UK?
I think we have to build our own model. I think we have to look at what our key issues are. I think if we try and replicate what Germany has when it is a different landscape, a different framework, and has been operating for a huge number of years, we cannot just pick it up and start doing things the way they do. We need to start with what are our key focuses, how do we think we can have the most impact, and really scale up operations and go from that. And it might end up that we look at things slightly differently. I know that Dr. Hergel's focus a lot is on investment in defence and pushing for bigger budgets. Does that necessarily tie with what we're saying about the welfare of service personnel? There may be issues that do cross over into that, but I think we would have a slightly different focus than the German Parliamentary Commissioner.
Thank you. And my last question on that, what do you think we should be learning from the German model that we can make improvements here?
The best thing for me from the German model that I would absolutely like us to learn from and take forward is the voice that she has within the German Parliament. She has a permanent seat. She sits in all of the sessions, and I'm not saying that the Commissioner should have that, but certainly the ability to lay reports directly or have them laid in the House so that more focus is placed on this. There is absolutely no point having all this access, having all of this information, creating the reports if they don't go anywhere and nobody talks about them. So that level of parliamentary oversight and visibility is absolutely what I think we should mirror from the German system.
Thank you.
Okay. We'll go to Pam Cox now.
Yes. The Ombudsman Association has questioned the use of the term commissioner in relation to this role on the grounds that that term is usually used for bodies with less influence. I wonder what your views are on that.
Well, I'm also a board member of the Ombudsman Association. You will not be surprised to know that my views align very closely with the chair of the Ombudsman Association. I understand why we are using the word commissioner based on the fact that we were mirroring the German system, but as set out in that letter from the chair, the Cabinet guidance is very clear that Ombudsman is the gold standard. As I've mentioned, we have 22 established schemes. We have a very wide network of Ombudsmen. We've also, within my office, spent a lot of time trying to get people to understand the value of what an Ombudsman is, what it does. Having been the Service Complaints Commissioner previously, I do worry that going back towards Commissioner, going from Service Complaints Commissioner to Service Complaints Ombudsman to Armed Forces Commissioner, feels like a step back, and it feels like if we're doing that, is the next step not Armed Forces Ombudsman, and do we not just go there straight away? Would be my view.
What's your view of the comparison between the broad powers of an ombudsman and a commissioner in this scenario?
In the Cabinet Office guidance, it simply says that if you do not meet the standards for independence, impartiality, integrity and fairness, then you cannot use the term ombudsman. So there is an inherent elevation, I think, to ombudsman. There's no real prescriptive powers of what an ombudsman can or cannot do compared with a commissioner. It's all broadly set on the legislation or the rules that govern. So each ombudsman scheme in the UK, whether they're statutory or voluntary ombudsman schemes, they have different powers, they have different remits. It's broadly what you make of it. But it's about the gravitas of that term. It's about the understanding in the wider landscape, what does an ombudsman mean? And we as the UK have accepted that an ombudsman is really sort of the top tier of fairness and oversight. And unless there are overriding reasons, I simply don't understand why we would use the term commissioner instead of the term ombudsman.
Thank you.
Good job.
Two quick questions, if I may. The first, you very clearly laid out what's new under the commissioner setup, and it's this, broader thematic. But it does strike me that it's quite, it's sort of an access all areas pass, backstage laminates, go where you want. And so do you think that the legislation as it's drafted constrains or directs you sufficiently? Because otherwise, how would you set your agenda given all that freedom?
Yeah, it is a very wide remit with the bill as drafted. I think the key thing will be the secondary legislation, the regulations, the schedules that cover exactly what that work looks like. I think it's also key that the individual sets out what their focus is, where they want to focus this work. I think there is a danger that we think this is going to be a magic silver bullet that will fix everything. You simply can't fix everything, and even with the power to go where you like and look at what you like, you have to have that focus on what is key to welfare. So I think the initial first year would involve a lot of scoping around what do we already know, what do we think we can fix, and what do we wish we would know, and really focusing that on within those broad categories set out in the bill, that this is about welfare. This is not about, going into all the back rooms and looking at all the sneaky files and exciting buttons just because we can. We have to always ask the question, why am I looking at this? What do I think I'm going to achieve? And how will this make life better for service personnel? So it is very wide, and I think it will need to be set out in regulations how that is to be directed, but I also would not want to constrain the individual from deciding what it is that they need to look at based on their experience.
And second question is, will you be applying?
If I am allowed to apply, as the Ombudsman, I can only do one term. Obviously, this is a new role. If it is decided that I am allowed to put myself forward for this job, I would love to be considered for it. I love what I do. I feel very, very passionately about it. As I've mentioned, these are the powers that we have been asking for. And from my perspective, it would also give the opportunity to ensure that the work of SCOAF, where we've got it to a really good standard, can continue uninterrupted, while then focusing on what does this look like, how can we take it forward, and how can we make this work.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for all the work that you and your team have been doing. I think, as been mentioned by the Shadow Minister, the transition in what SCOAF has been delivering has been quite remarkable, and I want to continue that journey. One of the key provisions of the Armed Forces Commissioner is their independence.
Yes.
And in my mind, if they're not regarded as independent, it won't work for people being able to raise concerns and issues with them. Could you just talk us through how independence works in your role currently, and how you feel an Armed Forces Commissioner that needs to maintain an independence from government, from ministers, from the chain of command might be able to operate on a day-to-day basis?
Absolutely. And I think the key point for me is that independence doesn't mean you're completely isolated. It doesn't mean you cannot talk to ministers. It doesn't mean you cannot work collaboratively. But it's about that unfettered ability to decide how your work is shaped. When I took on this role as a Service Complaints Ombudsman, one of the key things we always got, particularly in social media or in questions and queries about our services, well, how are you maintaining independence? You are funded by the Ministry of Defence. You must therefore be in MOD's pocket, and none of your decisions are actually independent. This is something all ombudsmen face because we have to be funded by somewhere, and it's usually the sector that we're overseeing. So it's not an unusual thing. One of our key priorities, therefore, was setting out to the public in a way that people can understand how we maintain that independence. So we've designed a governance framework, which I was, to be honest, quite shocked that we didn't have already when I took on the role. But that has now been laid in the House, and it sets out publicly that although the Ministry of Defence will provide my funding, they are not allowed to touch my cases. They are not allowed to design my business plan. They are not allowed to tell me what I can and cannot do in pursuing the aims set out with the remit of my role. I would expect something very, very similar with the Commissioner, setting out who has the power to do what, and actually, yes, reporting to Secretary of State, yes, funded by Defence, but entirely independent in the decision making. That would need to be set out.
That's helpful, thank you. And I guess related to the role of independence is also the definitions or the approach that you would take to national security. Because one of the challenges about a bill like this, because the powers are deliberately drawn very wide, you mentioned it briefly earlier about what decisions you're taking. Could you just talk us through how you assess national security in your role currently? Because actually there is a legislative scrub of reports contained within the bill, but actually it would be helpful for the Commissioner or for the role and for your role to be able to understand, or for members to be able to understand what you mean by national security when it's included in there. So can you just talk us through how you would regard that at the moment?
So currently, in terms of how we assess national security, we don't. We are overseeing just the service complaint system. This is about personnel issues. This is about issues they face in the workplace. We naturally have a few cases where we have to have information redacted because it is sensitive because of the nature of where that individual works, and we work very well with the services on deciding what should be redacted, what can be redacted, and actually in a report where we're just talking about someone's workplace experience, they probably shouldn't be putting information in that needs to be redacted. Going forward with the Commissioner role, if the focus remains on welfare, I don't think it's as much of an issue as it could be. And I understand the concern because the bill is so wide and gives those powers. But again, I can't really see a situation where the Commissioner would need to get that involved in those issues, if that makes sense.
That's good. And final question for me, just in relation to the powers contained within the bill about dismissing a Commissioner in the event of them being incapacitated or unable to fulfil their job. Could you just talk through how that would work in your current role currently, if there were to be a situation where you were not able to fulfil your duties, how that would work, and whether there's a difference between the framework that establishes your office and the Commissioner's office?
So the framework that's proposed in this bill is significantly stronger than what is currently in existence with my office. So I have similar provisions under my terms and conditions that if for any reason I am unable to fulfil my functions, then Secretary of State can terminate my employment. Equally, I can give notice. What is not in the current legislation, what is not in my terms and conditions, is the ability to appoint a deputy or an acting person to fill that role. This is a very, very real risk, and it is a gap. When I took on this role, there was actually a gap between myself and my predecessor where nobody in the office could do any work because there was no power unless it is delegated directly from the Ombudsman, and no power for the Secretary of State to put in an interim. So there was a small period where nothing could happen. That is a real risk, and at the moment, and again, touching wood, if I get hit by a bus and cannot come into work, there is nothing in the legislation that allows my staff to continue working unless I am there to delegate that power. So the current provisions under the bill, whereby the Commissioner can appoint a deputy, can delegate specific functions, and also in that event of incapacity or being unfit to do the job, can be removed from post, and an acting Commissioner can be put into place. That gives us a lot more security than what we have currently, and I am in favour of it.
Thank you.
Today, I'm going to go back to part of your introduction when you spoke about the number of complaints that you receive.
Yes.
And clearly the number of complaints that you receive are less than the valid complaints that probably should be made. So my question is around, how do you think that this particular role will encourage people who perhaps wouldn't always actively come forward, so those people who are from LGBT backgrounds, people who are non-UK personnel, how do you think that this role will enable them to come forward and make those complaints?
I think it will allow people who are experiencing an issue where it affects a wider group or a demographic to bring that complaint forward as a whole. There is a lot of onus in service complaints on it is resolution of individual grievances. So you can't bring a group complaint. It has to be my complaint with my named respondent. Now, we are doing as much as we can to make sure that that system doesn't feel onerous, doesn't feel combative, doesn't feel scary. But for some people, they are simply not comfortable putting their name down and saying, I want to complain against my employer because of this. Whereas actually, with this role, with that wider focus on welfare, you could form really good links with some of the networks to say, okay, when people come to you for advice, what are the things they are worried about? What are the things they are scared about? What are the policies that are affecting them? And use that as a method of, if those people still aren't comfortable raising individual complaints, what are the issues they are facing, and can we cast a light on it? Because I want everyone to feel safe to come forward, but equally, if we know there are problems, it shouldn't take the individual to come forward. If we know there are problems, we should be able to go and shine the light on it for them, so they don't need to do that.
So that leads on to my second question, which is around patterns and trends of complaints. And if this role will enable people to look at them and think, not waiting, just as you said, to think, oh, I've got to be the person who comes forward. How would you be able to address any patterns or trends that you see in complaints?
Absolutely, and I think it is key to look at the front end of complaints. By the time things come to us, they have been all the way through the process, are still unhappy with it, and they are asking us to fix it. And it's really important that we can fulfill that function. But actually the thing that went wrong maybe 12 months ago for that individual. So we have to see what people are coming to welfare for, what people are coming to the networks for, what people are using the Speak Out and Call It Out hub for. You know, when people are saying, I am seeing behaviours, I am having an issue, where can we get those sources of data to look into it? And that, I think, will be really important for the Commissioner to try and get ahead of some of those issues. Again, it's really important that when things go wrong, people can use the formal system. Ideally, I'd like to stop them going wrong and be able to have a look at where those little hotspots are and really focus that welfare work on that.
Thank you.
Well, we've got to finish at 9:55, but Amanda, Martin, do you want to ask a very quick question?
Yes, please.
One
of the biggest changes is the clause 3, which allows other people outside of the armed forces to make a complaint or raise a concern. Just a brief idea of, whether that's going to be a good thing or...
I think it's absolutely going to be a good thing. I think the bill pictures it right that those individuals will be able to raise concerns, but there is not, as I understand it, the intention to form a secondary service complaint system for them all to go through. But essentially, those relevant family members are people that we are expecting to live in certain conditions, expecting to there are various aspects of service life that apply to them that they simply have to live by, that affects everything they do, but they are not subject to service law, so they cannot come into the system. So understanding how that affects them, understanding how we are providing for the family members of those who serve us and protect us is really important. And it also gets around that thing where individuals might not want to raise a complaint because it will go on their record. Actually, their spouse might be able to put it forward for them and say, actually, they'd never say this to you, but this is really affecting our family and I'm worried. We also have the issue where we still know that people don't like to talk about their emotions, don't like to talk about what is affecting them. It is their family members and the people around them who see clearer than anyone what is happening and when there is a concern. So giving them an avenue to put their hand up and say, look, I think we need a bit of help here, or I think you need to look at this issue, is absolutely brilliant.
Very much. That brings us to the end of the time allotted to the committee to ask questions. I thank our witness on behalf of the committee. We will now move to the next panel. Thank you. Well, good morning. We'll now hear oral evidence from Ted Arnold, Senior Public Affairs and Policy Manager for Help for Heroes, and Angela Kitching, Director of Campaigns Policy and Research for the Royal British Legion. For this panel, we have till 10:40, and perhaps the panel can introduce themselves and say a few words about themselves or what they want, what they do.
Thank you for inviting us to give evidence. I'm Angela Kitching. I'm the Campaigns Policy and Research Director for the Royal British Legion. In terms of the bill, we have been holding focus groups with members of the armed forces community and their families, so current serving, to look at what their views are on the bill. Some of the interesting things that I think we'd like to draw out today are around how we can measure the impact of the role. We'd like to think about what the proper balance is between thematic and individual complaints given the new scope of the role, and also explore that issue of relevant family members and who will be able to raise complaints.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for the opportunity to give evidence this morning. My name is Ted Arnold. I'm Senior Policy and Public Affairs Manager at Help for Heroes. We are, of course, also a veterans charity supporting veterans and their families, so I'll very much be making comments from that perspective. We very much welcome the bill, and we see, the key underlying principle is calling for that more transparent culture to make it harder for defence to hide those embedded problems. That's very much a conversation we want to be a part of, and we believe, the veteran community have a lot of substantial insights to offer to that conversation as well. As we seek to improve the lives of serving personnel who will one day themselves become veterans.
Thank you. Francois.
Thank you very much, good morning to both of you. Thank you for joining us. Could I ask, please, firstly to the Royal British Legion, your briefing note makes a number of positive suggestions about the bill, and you make quite a bit about the Armed Forces Covenant and the duty that places upon government and parliamentarians. How, if at all, do you think that the new role of the Commissioner will help to strengthen our obligations under the Covenant?
As colleagues will know, the Covenant at the moment is the promise that the government makes on behalf of the nation to those who have served, their families and the bereaved. And I think that the role of the Commissioner can help to give that some teeth. Hopefully the way that the welfare remit is written will go beyond the current legal duties of the Covenant, and will allow the Commissioner to consider those thematic issues where service personnel and their families face significant problems. I hope that in places where the Covenant, such as Northern Ireland, where the Covenant doesn't have legal force, the Commissioner will be able to bring parties together and to coordinate a proper response from local authorities or from the national government to try and improve the experience of service personnel and their families. And I particularly want us to think about the position of the bereaved, who are often not well considered in terms of the Covenant. They are one of the groups of people who are supposed to be given special consideration under the covenant, and yet are often missed out when local authorities and others are planning their services around the covenant. So I hope that the Commissioner, in the definition of relevant family member, will be able to bring some of the experiences that the bereaved community have to the fore.
Thank you. And the bill's focuses on serving personnel.
Yep.
What, if anything, do you think the Commissioner will be able to do for veterans? Because if you read the legislation as drafted, it doesn't give the Commissioner much role in regard to veterans, and some people would argue that that is a sort of lacunae in the bill. What's the RBL's perspective on that?
Sure. I think that if the powers transfer as they are at the moment, then veterans who have experienced a problem in service, who have raised that through the service complaints system, will hopefully be able to continue to pursue their individual cases. And we would like clarity on that point, because it wasn't well explained, I don't feel, in the second reading. But in terms of the relationships that the Commissioner has, it's really important that they think about their relationships with Veterans Commissioners, with the VAPC, the Veterans Advisory and Pension groups that exist around the country, because if Haythorne-Thwaite is to be properly implemented, then it's going to be a spectrum of service where people pass from serving into reserve, into veteran and back again. And so I think spotting those themes will be really important to making sure that we've got a group of people in the armed forces community who can rely on the fact that they will be well treated when they're in a serving scenario.
One more on that. During the second reading debate, one issue that cropped up was the proposed UK Veterans Commissioner.
Yes.
And how, if at all, this Commissioner would interact with that Commissioner. But it's not clear how much progress has been made on the first one.
No.
So what's the RBL's perspective on that? And do you have any concerns about the rate of progress with regards to the UK-wide Veterans Commissioner?
Yes, you'll be aware that was an open advert and people were being invited to apply just prior to the election, and we haven't yet heard an update on what will happen to that role. We think that it's really important that there is a national commissioner, a national Veterans Commissioner, as it's described. And I think that in relation to this Commissioner, clearly the Armed Forces Commissioner will have a wider, deeper, better resourced role than any of the other commissioners do. But I think that there's a lot that could be learnt, particularly from the Scottish Veterans Commissioner, because they report directly to Parliament, that the Armed Forces Commissioner can kind of look to that community of commissioners on a regular basis to make sure that they're picking up issues as people are leaving service.
Thank you. And switching to Help for Heroes now, and for the record, Mr. Arnold, I had the privilege of knowing Bryn Parry, and who, of course, is no longer with us. And I think we still think of his widow Emma, and he was an exceptional man who did a great thing. What's your perspective from Help for Heroes on some of the veterans' issues that I've just put to the RBL, please?
Yeah, I think to build on what Angela said, I think from our experience and what we get told is the military works well and looks after its own until there's a problem in service, be it injury or illness, when often it closes ranks or withholds vital information or provides inconsistent or varied support. Sort of looking at the mantra of join well, serve well, leave well, we think it's often that last part that is largely, I think for particularly the wounded, injured and sick, is largely an afterthought. So that's a key message very much from our beneficiaries is around, in relation to during their service, that variability, inconsistency and uncertainty, particularly at the point of discharge and building up to transition. So, we know, for instance, the German model has looked at the issues of transition out of service and those policies and procedures about that, how they would impact personnel post-service. We think veterans can probably talk with greater openness as well about their experiences, with their service, with the benefit of distance and hindsight to really crack some of those issues open. One particular point, and I think that the Minister was right to point out at second reading that the agencies and services in place are very different from veterans, and it's important to make that distinction. But a lot of these issues stem at the point of discharge or transition, and obviously one issue we've been working closely with the Veterans Minister on at the moment is that calling for an independent review into the medical discharge process, where we believe the policies and processes are very much there, but are followed inconsistently across the three services, or not followed properly by the chain of command. But building on sort of those other thematic reviews that we can help emerge in regard to welfare more broadly, or in terms of sort of leadership style, or elements of training, kit, housing, those kind of issues. We believe there's a wealth of experience and a wealth of data and evidence that we ourselves hold from that community that we could very much like to build into those thematic reviews.
And lastly, Sir Edward, obviously on the veterans' point, most local authorities, in accordance with the covenant, have appointed armed forces champions. But I think it's probably true to say, and this is not a party political point, that it's very patchy across different local authorities. Some bluntly pay lip service that don't really make a lot of difference for veterans. Others really do go the extra mile, particularly in the allocation of social housing. What's your experience as Help for Heroes for how that system works at the local government level?
Yeah, I think we'd more or less see it similarly. It's sort of a postcode lottery in terms of support and how the covenant is applied. Again, there's inconsistencies there with the armed forces champions, and some areas are very good and obviously have high population density of serving personnel or veterans, and obviously very sort of aligned with some of those issues, and others less so. And I think that seeps into the whole sort of culture and drawing on a previous point made by the Ombudsman around having someone else to advocate on your behalf to take those issues, be it getting the right welfare support or healthcare support. For many, the armed forces champion is seen as that point, but others have to draw on family and the charity sector as well to mainly get the access to the support that they need.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John.
Graham Down.
Thank you very much, Chair. If I can just, there's 2 points that I should raise. First of all, possibly mostly for Angela from the focus groups and issues you've been discussing, but around some of the terminology in Clause 4 on general service welfare, just some of the terminology, if you feel it's appropriate and suitable for purpose. First of all, the term itself, general service welfare, do you feel that covers the correct areas? Similarly, words like in Part 2 may materially affect the welfare. Do we feel that's the correct terminology as well? Do we feel that is sufficient? And again, in Part 3, a relevant family member, is that something that we feel is correctly drawn? And just further down in Part 7, that the Secretary of State will give the Commissioner reasonable assistance. From the focus groups and the work you've done with your members, is there a feeling that that is actually the correct terminology? Will that capture everything that they feel the Commissioner needs to be involved in, or is there any work that can be done to either broaden or tighten some of those definitions?
Thank you. Technical question, I'll do my best. So I think welfare is a well understood term in the armed forces community. I think that calling out particular experiences of discrimination, bullying and harassment is useful, because that isn't held to be a welfare issue, that's held to be an employment and discrimination issue. So I think on that one, that feels appropriate. The second part that you raised was about whether or not was relevant family member. And I think that that's something that really does need significant further exploration in the committee and definition. I understand that the government intend to publish regulation when the bill passes from the Commons to the Lords, but I think that understanding what a relevant family member is has been a really disputed point in the armed forces community. So, for example, the parents of people bereaved parents of people who have lost their service person often don't feel that they are included in the world of the armed forces community. The siblings of those who are bereaved don't. Sometimes the families of non-UK personnel who are not residents in the UK often feel outside of that environment. So just understanding who a relevant family member is and being open to the fact that that person could raise relevant information. I think establishing really clearly whether somebody can raise a complaint or a concern, and there are 3 terms being used here: complaint, concern and issue. And so I think getting clarity over who is allowed to do what is extremely important, because otherwise it will unduly raise people's expectations that they will actually be able to follow something through in a formal process, when actually what they're being invited to do is to offer additional information for a thematic review. So in the way that that this is communicated to the armed forces community, there needs to be absolute clarity who has right to a complaint versus who's able to kind of more broadly raise a concern or an issue. And then I think the only other thing I'd mention really is that the process will be everything. So when I was surprised when we, at the focus groups, we had thought that what we would collect would be information about issues that people were likely to want to raise with the Commissioner if their scope were broadened. But actually, what people wanted to talk about was how safe they would feel in the process. So would they be prepared to raise something? Would they be able to do it jointly, as the Commissioner just raised? Would family members feel that they were able to raise concerns? Would it affect their person's career progression or ability to, continue to make progress? And I think also just there's a high level of distrust around certain areas of current service complaints. So, for example, service to type complaints where people are making accommodation complaints. At the moment, there is already a 3-stage process before somebody's able to approach before that process is closed and somebody's able to approach the Ombudsman. The middle of those the middle section of that process at the moment is so overwhelmed that people are getting standard messages to say, we're not able to progress your complaint on the current timelines. Now, that in itself would be a reason for somebody to be allowed to go to the Ombudsman, but I suppose I'm just saying they'll already, on an individual basis, have been through a really extensive paperwork process to try and pursue their individual complaint before they get to the stage where the Commissioner is actually reviewing the process. It's getting that balance of expectation right for individuals who are serving and for their family members about whether this is likely to be effective, whether it will get faster, or whether thematic reviews would be a better place to put their efforts if they've got a broader based complaint such as an accommodation issue.
And just supposed to relate to that, that's again the part in section 2, part B, where the Commissioner may in which the Commissioner's opinion may materially affect the welfare. Is there concern that almost that word choice creates the possibility of almost of a bottleneck? You can imagine being kind of artificially created.
Yeah, it's a very broad invitation where the in clause 4.3, where the Commissioner must consider any request made by a person subject to service law or a relevant family member to carry out an investigation under the section. That's a very broad funnel, which is helpful, I feel. Yeah. But I agree. I think that question of how material the impact is on the individual could be the point at which it narrows. And again, it's that question of clarity of process, isn't it? If yours isn't the issue that's taken forward from an individual complaint into a thematic review, how will you feel about that? Will you feel that your concerns are being dismissed, or that you need to get together many more people to make a similar complaint? I think there's going to need to be a very high degree of transparency about the decision making in order for that to feel appropriate.
Thank you. And just as I mentioned to the Ombudsman as well, can I just ask for clarity, probably from yourself, Ted, about how you intend this bill, how do you think this bill could work with the existing Veterans Commissioners, particularly in Scotland, and how to make sure this is applied equally across different parts of the United Kingdom?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think to build on the RBL's point as well, and their briefing is that, you know, it's vital that the Commissioner is seen as independent, and there's certainly a lot they can draw upon experience of those independent veterans commissioners throughout Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and hopefully soon in England too. I think they bring a valuable knowledge and insight, and act for a voice of veterans, the entire armed forces community throughout the UK. So I think we'd certainly encourage that coordination between the two agencies, particularly around sort of data and evidence sharing between the two. Again, with not just the Veterans Commissioners, but other agencies too, and the OVA, and the Defence Transition Services, and organisations in the charitable sector as well. So I think it's important that the Commissioner's work is communicated and integrated as clearly as possible with other veterans agencies, and also I think build on the Ombudsman's point is made, that those key relationships are built and that the right thematic reviews are being carried out.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Helen McGuire.
Thank you. So we touched on briefly family, and I think it'd be really interesting for the committee to understand what you class as family, because obviously families nowadays come in all different shapes and sizes, and there are various sections to that. So could you help us understand what your thoughts are on that?
Sure. So in terms of obviously there are family members, and from our point of view as a charity we have a definition of beneficiary, which would mean that there was some degree of dependency between the family member and the person who had served, or the serving person, or somebody who's bereaved of somebody who was in service. But in the real world, in terms of the people who feel most relevant to the person who's serving, that's often a much wider group of people. So that could well be the household that they came into service from. It could be the family that they left behind when they came from another country to serve on our behalf. Obviously, it could be their grown-up children, or it could be the group of people who immediately surround them and offer them support. I think it's about trying to make sure that as you're peeling back the layers of the onion, it's the people who are closest to the person who are serving, but not just their immediate household. If you think about the person who they live with, actually it might be much more relevant to also think about their parents. And typically at the moment, a large number of non-ranking people in service are passing through service in between the ages of 18 and 30, and so actually often they don't have other immediate spousal relationships. It's their parents or their grandparents whose household they've come out of, who are the people who are closest to them.
So would you, on that, would you rather see sort of like a broader principle of inclusion rather than exclusion when we're kind of defining family members, so that people don't feel excluded from the process?
Yes, and I think it's about where somebody can offer relevant information to the matter under consideration. So it's about how much relevant information they could have. But I do think it's worth us thinking about how to challenge the Commissioner's outreach into, for example, countries that person has come from, where that information might be held, because otherwise, unless there's an active outreach into those immediate relationships, I think people naturally think, well, I'm not in country and therefore I won't be able to offer my views on this process.
Great. And I also wondered what you thought the Commissioner could do in advance to kind of support personnel as they're serving, to help prevent some of the issues that we then see in veterans. And if there's anything in the bill that we can do to kind of help that.
Yeah, certainly some of the issues that Ted's raised around discharge are massively important throughout somebody's career. How somebody leaves the armed forces is crucial to their ongoing kind of experience in life. In terms of the issues that people raised during our focus group sessions, housing issues are key, and again, good transition around housing makes a huge difference. Healthcare and education access for family members is a hugely important issue. And if you look at the FAMCAS and AFCAS, the two main opinion-based surveys, then actually the issues around family and the extent to which family have got access to outside services are a key concern of serving personnel. And I understand that those issues won't directly be in the purview of the Commissioner, but as part of building their relationships, I think those are kind of, I would say, decent healthcare, access at discharge, support for their family members in accessing local services, and housing are the three things I'd really focus on.
And you mentioned, you touched briefly on trust, and I just wonder, this is really important that we feel that armed forces personnel can actually trust us. So how do you think the Commissioner can sort of be presented in such a way to serving armed forces personnel so that they can gain the trust of the military personnel?
Yeah, I think independence is really key. I think something that where they can see that the chain of command are listening to and are taking action as a result of the Commissioner's reports is really important. To be honest, I think the key thing is that the reports seem to have impact, and so they shouldn't just be reporting on the flow of cases and on the themes that have come out, but also on what's happened as a result of them. Because really that's the issue where at the moment I feel people can see that their individual complaints has got so far, but what they can't see is, was there a wider impact on the system, or was anything changed as a result of it? And I'm hoping that's where the parliamentary element of this will add that additional layer of transparency and trust. And one other thing, people talked about being able to raise concerns in an anonymous way, understanding that that meant that they then wouldn't personally get the kind of feedback as to what had happened, but they were very keen on a system that would allow them to raise those concerns with in the manner of Crime Stoppers, where what you're able to do is to give information in quite some detail, but it doesn't directly come back to you if you were the person who raised it.
And one final question, if I may, sorry. I noted that there wasn't actually any reference to the Armed Forces Covenant within the bill, and I wonder if you think there should be some reference to it within the bill. It's not something I've considered directly. I understand that there's consideration of extension of the covenants in law. It's really important that what we don't do is tie ourselves to the current legal definition, which is much more limited in the policy areas that it looks at. But I think anything that demonstrates that the covenant is the promise that the nation makes would be really useful, because I think that it's beginning amongst employers and in the healthcare system, in local authorities, it's beginning to be the golden thread that runs through the promise that's made, and so anything we can do to strengthen that is helpful, but I wouldn't want it to be too limited by the current quite narrow definition of the covenant and law.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. And thank you to Angela and Ted for being here and speaking with us today. So the title of the role is changing from Ombudsman to Commissioner. Yeah. And we heard in the previous session there are different perceptions with both those titles. Yeah. Do you think it's a good change moving over to Commissioner? And if not, where are the limitations?
Do you want to take it? Okay. I think that it's helpful because what it indicates is a move from a system that reviews the administration of an appropriate action in relation to individual complaints into a wider and more thematic system. So for me, that's what the indication, it signals that we're not in a situation where they are only going to be following through individual complaints anymore, and they are actually able to make wider representation. So it sounds more like, for example, the action of the Children's Commissioner. Now, I completely understand the concerns that the Ombudsman's groups would have about the fact that Ombudsman is the highest, kind of outside the courts, the highest way of considering individual complaints. But I think as long as it's well communicated within the community that this role and this office is capable of doing both, then I don't have particular concerns about the change in title.
Perfect.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think it's to set expectations and make very clear to the community what the new role is and what the new powers will be for them to, I think Angela spoke about that, trying to influence that cultural shift to make people feel comfortable that they can go to the new commissioner and take those, not just grievances, but other issues forward too, sort of best practice or issues, and that's for the, up and down the chain of command.
Thank you.
And Lorraine.
Morning, both. In terms of people, when they leave the armed forces, they sort of state morale is one of the biggest reasons why they intend to leave. Do you think the Commissioner's appointment and the powers they will have are going to have a direct impact on improving morale and therefore decrease the number of leavers in the forces?
Yeah, I just covered my notes.
That's fine. So yeah, in terms of as things things that are impacting morale at the moment, then they say that the impact on the impact of service life on their families, the opportunities that they've got outside service, and the amount of pay they have are the things that are currently undermining morale. If you're looking at evidence from AFCAS, but for family members, then it's their experiences of living a service life, and so you can see that there's an obvious potential for this role to try and improve that experience. And I think it's helpful to think about not just the individual complaints, but those wider welfare issues that just chip away at people's experiences of their time in service. But yeah, it is the number one reason given by service people for leaving is the impact on family and personal life. So anything that we can do to improve that's got to hopefully help with that broader morale issue.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think I think persistent issues with the current complaint system have sort of deepened that morale, that dissatisfaction with service life. And I think we look at the various reviews, Hayforthwaite, Atherton, Lyons, and the various reviews the Defence Select Committees carried out over the years. I think attempts have been made to address certain concerns with morale or certain groups, but the Commissioner could bring a much more robust approach to addressing some of those problems. So, I think we envisage, and the bill does too, about trying to involve it in day-to-day military life, so to get a real granular understanding of what those issues are.
Okay. And in terms of that, what would you think would be a sensible time frame where we can actually say there's been a direct correlation of the Commissioners come in place and we've seen an improvement? What would be a time frame to measure that over?
Yeah, again, I think it'd be difficult to sort of measure. I think having an annual review that reports to Parliament and perhaps for the community themselves to make observations, not just on thematic reviews, but the annual report as well. Similar way they do we do as a sector to the Covenant would perhaps be the appropriate way of seeing progress. Okay. Or measuring progress.
Did you want to add?
And I think thinking about how you measure the impact of the thematic reports is crucial to that. So I'd say that probably after that annual report, you'd then need to have a think about, okay, so what did we see that changed as a result of it? And at that point, I suspect you'll see an impact on morale and on people really feeling the difference, because there'll be something to point to. So it's also about that mechanism for the Commissioner to be able to follow up on recommendations from previous reports and look at change over time. And there needs to be an adequate capacity in the office for them to have access to data that allows them to track that change over time as a result of it. Particularly, and I know an amendment's gone down on this today, but particularly for groups whose experience might otherwise be invisible. So, very small percentages of people, but LGBT personnel, women in the armed forces in particular branches, the experience of non-UK personnel, so groups who otherwise will end up being subsumed into the whole. I think it's important, as in the German reports, that some of those experiences are drawn out in the annual report and we track change over time for particular groups who otherwise kind of end up being lost in the wider picture.
Great, thank you, Chair.
Thank you both for giving evidence. Can I just take you back to independence and trust? Because there's the legislating for independence is one thing, building trust in a system is quite a different thing. Could you just talk us through about what your expectations would be about how a Armed Forces Commissioner could build trust with Armed Forces personnel and the wider communities, notwithstanding their remit is predominantly on people who are serving and their families, but with that wider Armed Forces family as well?
Yeah. So I think that what people mentioned to us when we spoke to them in groups was that they needed to understand who the Commissioner was. They needed to understand its relationship with the existing welfare services in individual branches, but also with the wider service complaints process. So they knew exactly what to expect from them was really important. That their office was seen to be open both for serving personnel and their family members, so that they could make a direct approach and not feel like they had to chase through another system in order to be allowed to approach that person. That the person was prepared to visit, which obviously is the case for the current Service Complaints Ombudsman, but the digital access is a real issue currently, as you'll be aware, on areas of our defence estate, but also if people are operationally deployed or people are struggling to get access to enough technology to allow them to engage with complex digital systems. So what they didn't want was something that they would have to log into to understand the ongoing process of what was happening. You know, they needed somebody to be able to have that ability to be reached via a variety of different sources. And then, as I previously mentioned, something that would allow for transparency and a degree of anonymity, if they wanted it, in relation to thematic information, so that they were just able to kind of offer what evidence they had, even if they didn't want to pursue it as an individual complaint themselves. And I think particular attention needs to be given to experiences of bullying, harassment and discrimination. I just feel like in any other service that we look at that deals with those complaints, people have a significant amount of protection when those are being considered. And if, for example, a thematic review were to be opened into an issue that touched on bullying, intimidation or harassment, then I think particular consideration would need to be given about how that evidence was collected, because people understandably feel very vulnerable about offering that evidence. And the Armed Forces is a unique employer in that way, because it's not just a job, it's a life, and it's also the life of your family, and it's also potentially can control your future career. So the level of trust needs to be built, because the level of exposure and risk is so high if somebody chooses to step out of line and to raise something.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think just build on that. I think an effort's got to be made to change the current culture to really encourage individuals and people on their behalf to know that they can come to a commissioner. And I think as well, building on the German model is not just to raise issues of grievance, but maybe sort of other duty-related, this entire on that spectrum of duty-related issues, and not just problems, but sort of personal and social problems as well that they can raise. I think I'll leave it there.
That's good, thank you. Secondly, just in relation to the ability of Armed Forces personnel to raise issues, something that if you are in civilian roles, you have greater access to raise issues. Can you just talk us through how you think it might work in being able to raise an issue outside of chain of command, but it's still within what is, in our military, quite a hierarchical structure? Can you talk us through about how organisations like yourselves would be able to communicate the ways of that could work, that doesn't undermine discipline, that doesn't undermine military order, but also provides that opportunity for the Commissioner to hear from people about their particular concerns?
So when we've gathered views before, particularly on sensitive issues, what we have done is allowed people to speak openly with us with a very clear and ethical kind of statement about how we're going to use that information, which they previously agreed to. So there's certainly the potential for us to be able to then pass on that information on behalf of Armed Forces groups. We did that in relation to the Everton report when people didn't want to give individual evidence and didn't want to step forward themselves. We gathered those views and submitted them to the review team on behalf of people who didn't want to identify themselves. So there's potentially a role for organisations, I mean, not just us, many others, to do that. I think thinking about the location of those conversations is really important, and just being extreme, so they can't be on bases. They need to be in an environment where people feel comfortable to express themselves. But I think overall that it's the assurance that the Office of the Commissioner has a degree of separation from chain of command that is the most important thing. And so ensuring that the officer's got adequate resources to be able to do the kind of work I've just described will be important. And just trying to make sure that that person is able to demonstrate that they are sufficiently independent of current chain of command and are really able to bring forward views that will be very difficult for chain of command to hear is really important.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and also for chain of command to feel that they're comfortable in raising those issues as well, and knowing that it goes, it's going to the Secretary of State and to be considered by Parliament. I think it also adds to the importance of the Commissioner drawing upon data and evidence from the veterans community as well, and particularly those who've been recently discharged, or for some it takes many years for them to get help and reach that crisis point, and to have those reflections and say what could have been done better during my service. I think that just adds to that. There's the removal over time of being away from your service and not fearing repercussions, particularly with regard to your career. And like Angela said, the sort of Everton review was a great example of that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks.
Did you want to ask a question? Hancock's.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, we've got about three minutes here.
I'll be quick. Thank you for joining us today. I recognise much of what you say about the challenges of service life through my experiences on the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme and representing a garrison city in Colchester. And we all hope that the Armed Forces Commissioner will help to address those challenges. We talked about how we might measure the impact of a Commissioner role, but how might that impact be communicated? And what role might your organisations play in helping to communicate that?
So I think laying out from the start what the intended change is really important. So when we're asking the Commissioner to report, I don't think it can just be, it needs to be a report that looks at what the intended impact is and then try to measure against that. It can't just be a report of activity. So I think, and I also think trying to make sure that as the Commissioner opens thematic reviews, they invite evidence from organisations, from academics, from others who have got depth of experience in what some of the best ways are of addressing some of those issues, and therefore looking at the change that could be achieved over time, because many of these are well-trodden paths either as research issues in this country but also internationally, and looking at really what works in addressing some of the concerns. That evidence is readily available. We need to make sure that the Commissioner's on the front foot in drawing that in. In terms of Parliament, and I mean, as soon as reports are laid in Parliament, then obviously we do our best to try and make sure that they're well communicated in the community, but it's very difficult to reach into somebody's service life. They're in the middle of their job, as you'll have had experience, and their head is on the job. So I think it's making sure that they are very well networked in the Armed Forces community. So the Armed Forces Champions, who were mentioned, would be one way of making sure that the wider system understands the changes that are necessary. Thinking about Armed Forces liaison officers who are government appointed in Wales as a good model for saying, these are people whose role it is to reach into communities and are actually additionally resourced to do that, unlike the Armed Forces roles that are usually voluntary in local authorities and in the NHS. So it's about being well networked in the existing Armed Forces communication structures. I think there's also something about the welfare system, the in-service welfare system, which, as Ted mentioned, can be incredibly patchy in the way that it delivers outcomes for people. So I think there's probably a duty there that thinks about how better can we require the in-service welfare system to consider changes that come out of the Commissioner's office, and perhaps require them to write back to say this is the impact and this is what's changed as a result of it. But all of those methods at once, I'm afraid, is probably the way to do it.
Okay. Well, that brings us up to 10:40, so thank you very much to our witnesses, and we'll go to our next panel. Thank you. How do you say that? SSAFA?
I think maybe just the SSAFA. SSAFA.
SAFA is how it's normally pronounced.
Sorry?
It's normally pronounced SAFA.
Do you get me a bill?
Morning. We'll now hear oral evidence from Lieutenant General Sir Andrew Gregory, Controller of SSAFA, the Armed Forces Charity, and Lieutenant General Sir Nicholas Pope, Chair of the Confederation of Service Charities. And for this panel, we have until 11:25. Could our witnesses just introduce themselves, perhaps say a bit about themselves and what they do?
Shall I start? Good morning, sirs, ma'ams. Andrew Gregory, 35 years in the British Army, Royal Artillery. My last 3 years were as Chief of Defence People in the Ministry of Defence, so very much looking at these sort of areas, during which the Service Complaints Commissioner became the Service Complaints Ombudsman. So I've seen some of the transition, left the military in 2016 and have been the Controller, Chief Executive of SSAFA, the Armed Forces Charity, since then. I'm also a trustee of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Trust that runs the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme.
Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Nick Pope, I know some people on the other side of the table. I was an Army officer for 39 years. I'm struck by the age of the people at this end compared to the age of the people who were sitting here previously. I finished in my job as effectively the Army's 2IC, so very much dealt with the likes of Mariette and Nicola from the service complaints aspect from a single service perspective. And as the Army's 2IC, I was the principal personnel officer for the Army. I left the Army in 2019, and I'm now chair of the Service Charities Confederation, COBSIO. A couple of years ago, I also helped Rick Haythornthwaite to produce the Haythornthwaite Review of the Armed Forces community, which was probably the first time in a generation that we'd had a systemic look at the people function for the armed forces. So I really sit here really in three guises to answer your questions.
Thank you. Mark Francois.
Thank you very much, General. Good morning. General Nick, if we could start with you. Could you just give us some idea of how many service charities COBSIO now covers, and some idea of the different topics? I know you banded them together. How does that work? And then perhaps when you've done that, could you explain if it's possible to have a collective view from so many different charities, large and small? What's the broad view of the charitable sector of the bill and any strengths and weaknesses therein? If you could take it in those three parts.
Craigie. So thanks. I must start by commending you for the Filling of the Ranks report, which I think I've mentioned here before.
Thank you.
Which was one of our opportunities to look at the way we carry out armed forces recruitment, and I still go back to that report and read it by my bedside table. So military service charities, there are currently, we believe, around 1,735 military service charities, and some people would say, golly, that's an awful lot. We're the 1%ers, 160,000 charities in the UK, about 1,700 military service charities. The first thing to say is that too much, is that too little? It's irrelevant, because each charity is answerable through its board and its trustees to the Charity Commission. So we are not stuck with the number because it changes, but that is the number of charities. All charities are not the same. Of that number, a vast swathe are focused on heritage, museums and monuments, or service funds, ships, stations, aircraft stations. About 500 of that number really cover welfare and benevolence, the kind of military charity organisation that you would typically think of. Of the 500, about 25 raise about 90% of the money. So really, if you're going to focus on money and impact at the national level, the likes of Andrew in SSAFA or the Legion or Health for Heroes are the typical charities you would think of. That's not to decry the enormous contribution made by smaller charities. So at the local level, if you're thinking of a drop-in centre or a breakfast club, a means of bringing together veterans, particularly for comradeship and belonging. There's a fantastic amount of work done. But my point is, therefore, the word charity covers a different smorgasbord of activities. In the sector, we tend to slice and dice the way we bring our charities together through what are known as clusters or communities of interest. So like-minded charities will come together to talk about, I don't know, mental health or housing or employment or non-UK or female. So we use the charity sector to think thematically about issues. Sectorally, we've got an executive committee where Andrew sits on alongside 16 other chief executives. It's like the United Nations Council, where we try to garner the systemic issues across the sector. It's right to say that there's not a view, there's not a sector view, but what the sector can do is bring together information to say these are the kind of views that exist across the military charity sector. It's probably also fair to say that the sector focuses not exclusively but predominantly on the veterans community, but that there are some charities who are also linking back into serving personnel. So we tend to think about not veterans or serving, but we try and use the nomenclature of the armed forces community because it picks up the bereaved, it picks up spouses, it picks up dependents, it picks up the entire gamut of those who are existing in the armed forces community. And at the broadest number, you might say that's about 6 or 7 million people. So gusting 10% of the UK population have some relationship with the armed forces, which is a large number.
And that's a good description of the breadth of the waterfront that COBSEO covers. Thank you. Are there any particular strengths or weaknesses in the bill that you would like, on behalf of COBSEO, to highlight to the committee before we debate it on Thursday?
I'm well aware, having read the Hansard scripts from the second reading of the bill, most of the issues which I cover will not be unfamiliar to you all. So I would say that the sector welcomes the bill. It welcomes the creation of an Armed Forces Commissioner. It will absolutely be looking, as we go towards the selection of a commissioner and further determination of the scope, to pick up on some of the issues you talked about with regard to independence, with regard to the boundary between the armed forces serving community and those who have served. So the ambit, the responsibility of the commissioner function, I think, will be areas that we're interested in. And from a sort of a selfish sectoral perspective, the way that we as a sector engage as a stakeholder with the commissioner, those are the kind of activities that we're looking for.
Thank you very much. And General Andrew, on behalf of SSAFA, could I ask you a similar question? I'm sure you looked at the second reading debate too. I know you're a very thorough chap. Are there any strengths or weaknesses in the bill from a SSAFA perspective you'd like to highlight to the committee today?
Thank you. I mean, firstly, I would highlight that SSAFA, for those that don't know, just coming up 140 years old, formed in 1885 as the Soldiers and Sailors Families Association. So although Nick says military charities are mainly focused on the veteran community, actually we do a lot of work in the serving community in many different ways. I won't sort of spread on that. So I think my view on the Commissioner, and I have read, like Nick, the Hansard report, initially I was concerned that it would undermine potentially the chain of command. I am not concerned anymore. I've had a good session with the Minister for the Armed Forces. We both have. I am reassured on that. I think the challenge is, and Nick has talked about this, there is a continuum from before people join the armed forces, when they're thinking about it, through their first day of service, through their service, to their departure, to their subsequent life. And trying to sort of say the Commissioner will only look at the time when people are subject to military law, regular and reservist, I think will be quite difficult, because you cannot divorce some of the consequences of military service on welfare issues during military service. I also think, going back to Haythornthwaite and some of the propositions being considered as part of the defence review, particularly the people proposition, where quite rightly, in my view, they are looking at what they're choosing to call one defence. So people in uniform, full and part-time, people not in uniform, full and part-time, all delivering to defence outputs. Absolutely right. I think that is exactly the model that should be used. But the commissioners potentially are going to look only at a part of that ability to deliver defence's outputs. So my only concern is what the commissioner should be doing, he or she, is looking at how best to sustain defence's outputs. And the person is tasked to look at welfare issues. I worry that there are some artificial divides that may not help that person do their work.
Thank you very much. That's me, sir.
Yeah, Terry Jeremy.
Thank you, Chairman. Sir Andrew, first, if I may. First, I work with SSAFA quite closely. You've got some fantastic volunteers in Norfolk, so thank you for the work that your organisation does. Prior to this role, I was a local councillor for a number of years and worked with SSAFA to encourage people to come forward and to, first of all, raise an issue, but more often wanting to formalise an issue. And that was quite a barrier, encouraging people to go through that process. And I wondered from your perspective if you thought these proposals would encourage people to actually be prepared to raise issues, but also to then want to formalise them.
So it's a great question. And I think you, in your previous session, talked about how you generate trust. And I thought that was a really good question too, because this person must be trusted. They've got to be sufficiently trusted by the chain of command, but equally they've got to be trusted by the community that they will fairly champion their views without, when appropriate, revealing their cover and identity. And that will be quite a tricky balance. The challenge we find with many service personnel, and particularly veterans, is they are often too proud to admit they're finding life difficult. And that could be while they're serving, and it's often once they've left the military. They don't want to admit they're a charity case or whatever. So going back to the conversation you had previously about trust, this person is going to have to work very hard to say, I really am here for you. I'm here to champion your issues in whatever way we feel is collectively appropriate. That person is also going to have to work hard to make sure that at the same time, the chain of command, and we've both been part of it, don't start to get defensive, but see this as an opportunity. So when Nicola Williams, and I wasn't still serving when Mariette Hughes was the Service Complaints Ombudsman, when Nicola was doing the job, we used to talk regularly. I was effectively on one side of the defence as the policy lead in the Ministry of Defence. She was on the other side. Success to me would have been more complaints. And trying to get people to have the confidence to step forward, and for those of you that have met Nicola, a very approachable person, trying to get people to have the confidence to go to her to say, this ain't fair, was really difficult. So I think the intent is very good. I support it. I think building the confidence will continue to be a challenge.
Okay, thank you. And Sir Nicholas, the use of the word commissioner, it means different things to different people, I find. I wonder if you had any views on the use of that particular title and whether you thought it was appropriate.
So I had the answers given by the previous panel on this particular issue. I'm quite relaxed on this particular issue. What's in a word? We use the word veteran to pick up a whole smorgasbord of kind of individuals. We use the word service or sector, again, interdivisibly. What it does, I suppose, demonstrate in moving from ombudsman to commissioner is a shift in a position. So if we're going to use the word actually from a sort of a communications perspective to get to people to think differently, then there is utility in that. And certainly, I know, having spoken to Mariette about this, she would feel, I suspect, putting words into her mouth, that she's prescribed in some of her activities by the way that her job has been set up. I think in a move to commissioner, we've got a chance to think about using a new post through a different prism and communicating it that well, both to the current armed forces serving community and also to those who come. And I think if I can go slightly off-piste there, if you think the average tenure of somebody who's serving is about 7 years, most individuals in that time will graze through without ever coming across the current Ombudsman. So I think one of our challenges looking forward, and probably a challenge for both the Commissioner's post but also the wraparound of the department, is to ensure that young men and women who are joining in the future recognise this function, recognise the idea of a champion that sits out with the chain of command, that gives them a chance to hear their voice. And in an area where I think agency at the individual level, if you think about Generation Z and beyond, agency is increasingly important. That's kind of matters.
Thank you both. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being here today. To flip Terry's question on its head, do you think this could actually have negative implications in terms of culture within service life and usher in a sort of new wave of complaining?
Can I start on this one?
He wants to get.
I want to get off. Yes. So what we've got to be very careful, I think, in the Commissioner's role, is to ensure that we don't chase demons unnecessarily. I love the phrase, the bumper sticker that underpins the Armed Forces Covenant, which is a thriving Armed Forces community valued and supported by society. So 5 issues: thriving Armed Forces community, value, support, society. 97-98% of those young men and women who go through service have a fantastic time, and they come out with additional skills, valued by the individual, valued by organisations who employ them, valued by society for having served. Support, absolutely, in my type of territory, in the charity sector and in some of the statutory service provision, to catch those individuals who need support to get them back to being thriving members of society. There's a danger, therefore, that in concentrating on the areas of damage, harm, complaint, we don't have the context within which we see it thriving. Why is it important? Because if we want young men and women to join the armed forces in the future, they've got to recognise that there's a value in so doing, and actually service benefits not only the nation, but also them as individuals. So that's the area that I think we just need to just capture the context, I suppose.
So I completely agree with that, and we need, as a nation, better to promote the narrative service in the armed forces is good for you. It makes great people. It does not damage the majority. There are systems to pick up those who are damaged. I don't see the Commissioner as a threat, and I said earlier, it did previously worry me. So when both of us have been commanding officers, when I was a commanding officer, who could the soldiers and indeed officers go to if they wanted to talk to somebody outside the chain of command? They could go to the padre, the doctor, and perhaps the welfare officer, but particularly the padre and the doctor, because they were independent. They then had to get the trust of those individuals, because quite often the solution was within the remit of the chain of command. So they had to get their trust to say, I'd like to go back to the commanding officer with this, and then we can see how we can work it through. And for some, that was quite a tricky hurdle to overcome. So I think what the Service Complaints Ombudsman has provided at a high level and what the Commissioner will provide is something at a higher level. I know it's very simplistic, but not dissimilar to those sort of people who can pick up both individual and systemic themes that are affecting people. So the chain of command has got to get used to it. What it is not, this role, is a federation, a union. That would have been very different, and that would have been very dangerous in my view. I don't see it as that. I think this is an opportunity to improve life and improve trust on both sides. I really mean that.
So just on that, how do you think this new role will be communicated down then? So down to a commanding officer to tell their service personnel. What level of severity do you think would warrant going to see the Commissioner, and how do you think that will be communicated to soldiers?
So I think service people are intelligent people. and they will make an appropriate judgment. And providing the Commissioner and his or her office, because they're going to need quite a lot of support to manage, two quite different things, the individual issues that are going to percolate up to this person and some of the systemic themes they want to investigate, poor quality housing, whatever it happens to be, to challenge ministers in Parliament with their reports. Communicating to young service people, you've now got a separate opportunity, somebody who will pick up your issues and run with them for you. I think people will get that, actually. I really do. And I think intelligent commanders at various levels, if they see, and that we're fine balance here, I do get that, if they see issues that are really, really to the detriment of their people, to start to have a conversation, and people will have to judge it very carefully with this Commissioner. I can see that happening.
I'd like to tier the answer to this question into political ambition, policy formulation, service delivery, lived experience. And I think you're going to be looking at the Armed Forces Commissioner to want to tap into all of those particular areas. So the point that Andrew brings up here, which is about lived experience, one of the aspects that the Commissioner will get will be a number of direct interventions with individuals who will raise issues that concern them, which is fine and is necessary. That will, part of that Commissioner's function, I think, is about dealing with those individuals at the individual level. The next issue, though, to bring it up a level, is about the service delivery level. Is the system that the Ministry of Defence has set up sufficient to deal systemically with some of the issues that the individuals are bringing to the Commissioner's attention? Which takes you back into policy formulation. To what extent are the current policies, so let's take the service complaint system, designed to be efficient, effective and fair? Do we need to look at the policies as well? And then the final level, which becomes a political choice, I suspect, within a finite budget, if you start to think about the accommodation, we know the answer to this already. We know that the accommodation for the service families accommodation, single living accommodation is not where we would like it to be. What political choices are there within a finite budget to start to address these kind of issues more systemically? So I think the Commissioner's function will start to tap in each of those four tiers of activity. And I suspect that one of the things that we will look at with the Commissioner when the Commissioner's report is laid before Parliament is, having laid a report about Parliament and having the opportunity at parliamentary level to debate the report, that feeds back into the MOD. To what extent are the recommendations that the Commissioner's made going to be manifested in demonstrable changes in the way that the department thinks? I mean, I think about the last 8 Service Complaint Commissions, Service Complaints, Ombudsman's reports, all of which have said that the system's not effective, efficient and fair. QED is actually the report itself driving the change in the department that we would seek. That's it.
Thank you, Generals. Amanda Martin.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. You touched on it actually, Sir Andrew, when you talked around the size of the job and the role. And do you think that the proposals for the resourcing of the Commissioner Office are adequate to enable to fulfil those functions? And just as a second, just to add in, because you've talked a lot around trust, transparency, and the other speaker spoke around impact. I mean, from either of you, is there anything else that we would need to think about to make sure that the interaction between chain of command and the Commissioner is coherent and successful?
So in terms of resources, I think how long is a piece of string is the honest answer. Would one always like more? Possibly. I think the government, assuming the bill is approved by Parliament, will want to see the first Commissioner given a fair chance to succeed. And I think once that person is in situ and has looked at the scale of the job, they will challenge the Secretary of State for Defence particularly. And given the ability of the Commissioner to go back to Parliament, he or she could then say, I can't do my job. So I think there will be an appropriate balance struck. In terms of this business of gaining trust, once again, I do think, listen to the earlier answers from Ned and others, which I agree with. I think it is down to the person to really project themselves, to get out, absolutely agree, be seen on the ground, talk to the various parts of the community. That's how it's going to work. So in the first year, this person will spend an awful lot of time doing that.
I would just add to that. I think the figures in the paper are based on some analysis from compatriots in Germany and building on the current SCOAF function. So there is a logic to the figures. Whether we, the department, choose to expand or contract is probably an issue for 3 or 4 years hence. I really buy the idea of trust. I think the word that I would use is culture here. And I'm going to be really interested to see how the Commissioner starts to pick at some of the issues which we've seen regularly through the Wickerton report, the Lions report, the Atherton report, or so on, to start to get at the culture issues which make towards more inclusive armed forces.
I think if I could just come back with the second bite at the cherry. The other challenge is seeing through recommendations, and that does worry me. So I have been part of the Armed Forces Covenant Reference Group almost since it was established in 2010. And the Secretary of State, as part of that, is tasked to put a report before Parliament each year. Some of the themes are very consistent in all those reports, I think is the polite way of putting it. So how we make sure that recommendations made by the Commissioner are either addressed or are properly answered, as back to this question of resources for service families, single living accommodation. We can't do it at the moment, but we have a journey that we're going to take it on to improve life for families in that way. That is one of the things that does worry me, because these things, they have their moment in court, their moment in Parliament, and then we move on and forget it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming. So, General Landry, I've got a question for you. So within the Armed Forces, obviously got tri-service, and there's all slightly, different cultures within that. The Gurkhas as well, and I just wondered if you felt that the role of the Commissioner, in order to be kind of trusted by the service personnel, if they needed to be adapted slightly.
Is that to me?
Yes.
Okay. You're absolutely right. And we're all part of the armed forces, and we're quite different as tribes within it. And then within the army, we have sub-tribes called regiments, and they're pretty different too, actually, and all with their own traditions and culture and things like that. And then you had the Brigade of Gurkhas, of which Nick, has served very closely, with a wonderful tradition and history. So how you capture all that, we do it within SSAFA, we support the whole community. How do we do it? We take each person and each family on their merits concerning their issues. We support 2,000 Gurkha families each year. The support we provide to them is quite different to the support we provide to some of our other beneficiaries. I think, sort of flanneling a bit, I think to answer your question, that the Commissioner will need to be sufficiently knowledgeable about the armed forces so he or she understands the various components, how they live their lives. For example, traditionally, as I'm sure many of you know, the Navy have lived their lives, this is a generalisation, in different ways to the Army. The Navy, service person goes to sea, family stays static, perhaps around Portsmouth, Faslane, Devonport, perhaps near their own family. Army traditionally have more had camp followers. Family have moved as the regiment has moved. That is very different and puts different pressures on both the service person and the families. The Commissioner will have to get his or her head around that.
And the other thing I think that's happening, you'll have seen, obviously with SSAFA being such an old charity, is that the needs of military personnel has changed over the years.
Oh,
and so I just wonder what you think that will mean for the role of the Commissioner.
So absolutely, the needs of people coming to us are changing. What we've seen, so I've been the Chief Exec of SSAFA for 8 and a bit years, and we've certainly seen a significant change even during that time. People coming to us are younger, not just because the World War II and National Service generation are slowly passing on, sadly. More working age veterans coming to us, more complicated issues, multifaceted issues. I say one or more of the Ds has gone wrong in their lives. Drink, debt, drugs, divorce, depression, domestic violence, a dependency culture, digs, housing, disease, death or disability. It won't be all of them. I'll test you later. It won't be all of them, but it will be more than one. And so what our people are doing is taking, back to your first question, taking each case on its merits and looking at it. And the Commissioner will need to understand that in terms of service families, service personnel as well. The cases will be different and he or she will have to pick that up.
Thank you. And General Nicholas, just one question for yourself with your past experience of the Ombudsman service. What would be your personal kind of biggest ask of the Commissioner in their new role?
If the Commissioner is going to be shining a spotlight or shining a light on the current welfare conditions of the armed forces community, in a way which enables Parliament to have some evidence to have a sensible discussion about the shape and the way that the Ministry conducts its business, the way the Ministry makes its choices about resource allocation, policy formulation, service delivery, then to have proper teeth, I would want to see within 3 or 4 or 5 years some tangible changes in either resource allocations or in terms of the metrics which are coming back through the Commissioner to Parliament. Because unless we see that, really, then there's no real impact or effect out of creating a post. So to get real teeth, we've got to have that feedback loop that Andrew talked about in a way which matters.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. First I want to say thank you to SSAFA for the work they do in Fife. It's been incredible the work they've done since when I was a councillor and they do on an ongoing basis. Just to pick up something you mentioned earlier on about, obviously SSAFA's been around for a very long time, where do you see some of the themes or thematic issues that have existed with forces personnel over the years, and where do you think the Commissioner should perhaps be looking first for 2 or 3 things on those thematic areas that they could be looking at?
Mm-hmm. So I'll come to your question. I think there's an interesting discussion going on. So the Minister for Veterans and People, Al Carnes, has commissioned Operation Valour, which I think is great. Both Nick and I have engaged with that to look at how better we support veterans. So I do worry that we've got sort of bits looking at veterans, looking at service people and their families, slightly working in isolation, because I come back to this point about the continuum. And for veterans, setting the conditions in service for success outside is absolutely critical. So in terms of themes, I think areas the Commissioner might wish to focus on, I mean, there are some obvious ones, which are the issue of service accommodation, where Defence, and during my time, we started off with something called the future accommodation model, then it became the new accommodation model. What's the current term? Can't remember.
Accommodation offer.
Accommodation offer, you know, trying to get something that meets the aspirations of modern servicemen and women and their families, has proven quite difficult. So I think that will be an area. I think I'm very proud of my service. I'm very proud. People say, what would have made you leave early? Had the services ever compromised on their values and standards? But I do also think there are some cultural areas of shame in the armed forces, and how better we can tackle some of those issues, I think, would be another area the Commissioner would certainly wish to look at relatively early in their tenure.
So I'm going to go back to Haythorn's way, if I may, to answer the question. And one of the pieces of evidence that we were putting in the report was very much about how over time the role of the family has changed, and how family conditions drive individual aspects. I was most struck when I took Rick down to Poole to visit some of the blades in Poole. We had a table like this with 25 members of the Special Boat Service sitting around the table, and the question I posed to them was, who's going to be here in 5 years? And not one hand went up. And I said, that is shocking. Why? And the reasons were family-based. It was about time away from Christmases, accommodation standards, the inability of spousal employment, the issues that therefore matter really are spouses focused. And I think if we have a commissioner who's focusing in one area to make a difference, it will be spousal employment. I remember going back about 10 years ago, taking a decision to bring the army out of Germany and selling it to the then Secretary of State, Phil Hammond, as a savings measure, because it was a lot cheaper to have a UK-based army based in the UK for the first time in 300 years. The reason that we took the decision as an army was predominantly around the lack of spousal employment opportunities in Germany. If I was to be brutally frank, yes, there was a change in the geostrategic landscape, but we could not get enough young men, particularly men, to want to serve in Germany because it was going to impact on dual income families. So spousal employment, spousal opportunities, looking at family conditions would be an area I'd hope we could really unpack in a big way.
And just on the point you made about some of the shame factors around the armed forces in the past, would you see a role of the commissioners being essentially to be proactive and preventative in heading those off? Just by one final last quick question.
So it's a great question. So I hope the Commissioner would, in that space, want to work with the chain of command to support them, because I think the chain of command are trying, and I would say this when I served, trying desperately to get it right. Nobody liked some of the awful headlines we've had over suicides, over, obviously the biggest issue ever was Deep Cut, but there have been plenty of examples where we all, those of us who are part of the military community, hang up our heads in shame, and we should, because this is not how young people should be treated. So the chain of command, are not complacent, they're doing their best. And if you have somebody who is there to say, right, I'm going to challenge you, which the Commissioner must do, but equally I'm going to support you, because we're all collectively on a journey to make this part of society and employment better.
Can I add a little bit of a codicil to that?
Can I just get across? I'm slightly conscious of running out of time as well, but can I just maybe ask you to answer that, but also just to include in there what role you feel that you as charities would have with the Commissioner in heading off some of these issues on a more practical, day-to-day basis as well?
So I'll start with the codicil, if I may, very, very quickly, which goes back to my beaten record about context here. And the suicide one's a good example. So the report on suicide in the armed forces community said that in every sector, stand fast young men aged 18 to 24 in the army, the armed forces were better than UK society. The headline in the paper at the weekend was young men in the army aged 18 to 24 at equal risk as the population to suicide or damaged. So the ability for the Commissioner to say, what is it about service actually that is actually as a prophylactic activity? One's too many, but by God, we're doing well.
I'm going to interrupt you there, because I'll get the Minister and we're running out of time. So can I just get the Minister to answer his questions, please?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to interrupt. Can I just ask you, with your previous roles hats on, to think about the unannounced visits power that is in the bill? Because one of the bits that I feel very strongly about is the ability of the Commissioner to visit a base in the UK unannounced to be able to look at general service welfare matters. Could you just talk us through what effect just having that power you think would have on how our military would address general service welfare matters in the broadest sense? Whether it is used or not, it would be a power the Commissioner would have in their toolbox.
Yeah. So I think there's probably two aspects to that from me. Firstly is, if this works well, then units should embrace the challenge, the perception of challenge that's going to come with an unannounced visit. So if you're a unit that's functioning effectively, you should not have no worries about this. If you're a unit that's hiding cultural issues, then good, you're going to be found out. If it's an issue about systemic stuff like housing or accommodation, it will be well known. Your ability in the chain of command to address some of those issues is rather prescribed, but you would actually welcome the chance, I hope, to give evidence to the Commissioner to say, look at the mould on the walls, look at the living accommodation. It's provided by the Defence Infrastructure Organisation out with my control. Please help me to try and change so that my young men and women under my command have a better improvement. So I'd hope that people will start to welcome it. And the optics of it, in terms of, the Commissioner's coming out to do his or her job, I think that's fantastic and will act as a real catalyst for change.
I would support that entirely. I think if you've got something to hide, you should be worried. If you haven't got something to hide, be proud of your unit, garrison base, and welcome the Commissioner coming to look at some of the wider issues.
Brilliant. Secondly, just really quickly, one of the key parts of this legislation is something that we can't actually legislate for, and that is Parliament picking up the issues when the Commissioner reports their findings, their recommendations to Parliament. Can you just talk us through how you think your organisation's roles will change in that situation? Because you would have the ability to say, here is a recommendation, and then the opportunity to say to parliamentarians of all parties, of all different structures, shine a spotlight on this. How do you think you will behave differently when those reports are brought forward compared to how, say, the SSAFA reports are brought forward and largely don't enjoy large-scale parliamentary scrutiny?
So in SSAFA, we have chosen deliberately not to be a lobbying organisation, to work with officials in the Office of Veterans Affairs, in the Ministry of Defence. We feel that is our best role. Other charities do a great job in that space. The Royal British Legion, particularly, I would commend. And I think also Fighting with Pride, of which I am the patron. And I'm very proud of that role, and there's a debate on Thursday about exactly some of these issues. So we will not change. We will continue to work, thank you for the compliments about SSAFA, to support serving personnel, veterans and their families. We will not change our position.
Thank you.
I think we in the sector have got two or three ways of interacting with the Commissioner. First is during the generation of a report. I suspect that we as a community will build up a relationship with the Commissioner, particularly through the Serving UK Personnel Cluster. So charities who've got an interest in the serving communities will engage in that fashion. When a report is laid before Parliament, and when we've looked at the current annual Covenant report, the committees tend to come back to the charities for a session like this to ask our opinions, and I suspect that kind of opportunity will again be of use, particularly with those charities which I say have got sort of skin in the game of focusing into the serving community.
Thank you. Thanks.
I think we've got to stop it there because otherwise we won't finish on time. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you for your evidence. Committee adjourned till 2:00.